56% of Americans can't cover a $1,000 emergency, and that's the middle class. Not people living in poverty, not people who never finished school or never held a steady job. Middle-income households, people with cars, mortgages, streaming subscriptions, and a 401k they check once a year. That number should bother you more than it probably does. And by the end of this, there's one specific group inside that statistic that's going to genuinely surprise you, because they're the ones who expose how deep this problem actually runs. Here's the thing, we talk about financial fragility like it's a character flaw, like the people closest to the edge just didn't try hard enough, didn't save enough, made too many bad choices at Starbucks. But that framing is doing a lot of work to hide something much more structural. Here's what people think, this is a discipline problem. Here's what's actually true. It's an architecture problem, and the architecture was built this way on purpose. Stop for a second. If the majority of American households are one bad week away from a financial crisis, that's not a personal failure. That's a system operating exactly as it was designed. And most people are just now realizing they're inside it. I'll show you the specific mechanism that makes this inescapable, even when your income goes up. But first, let's put some real numbers on the table. The Federal Reserve runs a survey every year called the Report on the Economic Well-Being of U.S. Households. In the most recent data, roughly 37% of adults said they would borrow money, sell something, or simply couldn't cover a $400 unexpected expense at all. $400. $400. Now layer that with this, the average American household carries about $6,000 in credit card debt. The average car payment is over $700 a month. And median household savings, not wealth, just liquid savings, sits somewhere around $8,000. For half the country, it's under $1,000. When you put those numbers next to each other, you stop seeing individual bad decisions. You start seeing a pattern. And there's a piece of research, from JP Chase of all places, that completely reframes which households are actually most at risk. I'll get to it, because it probably isn't who you think. So why are so many households this exposed? Part of the answer is income, obviously. Wages haven't kept pace with costs in housing, healthcare, or childcare for decades, but income alone doesn't explain it. Here's what most people assume: earn more, stress less. Here's what actually happens: earn more, spend more, almost automatically. And the spending that absorbs each raise isn't random. It's sticky in a way that makes it nearly impossible to reverse. There's a behavioral layer that's just as important, and it's called the consumption treadmill. When income goes up, spending tends to go up with it, almost automatically. A raise comes in, the apartment gets upgraded, the car gets replaced, the kids go to a better camp. None of these are bad decisions in isolation. Each one is completely rational. But collectively, they absorb the raise before it ever touches a savings account. Economists call this lifestyle inflation. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation. Either way, the result is the same: more income, same margin. Here's what makes it worse. The expenses that absorb those raises aren't random, they're sticky. You can cancel Netflix. You cannot easily downgrade your apartment, give back the car, or pull your kid out of the school district you moved into. The spending locks in. The income doesn't always. So households aren't failing to earn more. They're failing to widen the gap between earning and spending, and the whole economic environment is designed to close that gap as fast as it opens. Now here's the JP finding I mentioned, and this one genuinely changes how you read every other statistic in this video. Research from the JP Chase Institute tracked real transaction data across tens of thousands of households and found that income volatility, not income level, was the single strongest predictor of financial distress. Meaning a household earning $60,000 a year with irregular income was statistically more likely to miss a bill than a household earning $40,000 with a predictable paycheck. The math isn't broken by how much you earn, it's broken by how little buffer you have when the timing goes wrong, and almost no household is building for timing risk. They're building for average months, and life doesn't deliver average months. Which brings me to the group most people completely overlook when they think about financial fragility. And when you see the data on them, the whole picture shifts. Now, here's the part most people skip past, and it's the part that actually changes how you see this problem. Financial fragility isn't just about cash reserves. It's about what researchers call financial shock absorbers, the combination of savings, yes, but also credit access, social networks, job flexibility, and insurance coverage. Think about what that actually means. Two households, same savings account balance, completely different levels of real resilience. A household with $800 in savings and a sibling who can loan them money in a crisis is in a fundamentally different position than a household with $800 in savings and no one to call. The number looks identical. The actual resilience is not. A 2019 paper from the Aspen Institute found that the households most likely to spiral from a single financial shock, a job loss, a medical bill, a car repair, weren't the poorest households. Here's what we assume. The poorest households are the most fragile. Here's what the data shows. It's moderate income households, the ones who had just enough to not qualify for safety nets, but not enough to actually absorb a hit. The gap between too much for assistance and enough to be okay is where millions of American families live permanently. That's not a fringe population. That's a structural blind spot in how we measure financial health. We look at income, we look at debt, we almost never look at shock absorber depth. And that's exactly what determines whether a bad month becomes a bad year. But here's what I haven't told you yet. The income group that is nearly as financially exposed as households earning half as much. And once you see that number, the standard advice about just earning more completely falls apart. So here's where I want to flip everything you've been thinking. Because the group you'd least expect is the one that exposes how deep this problem actually runs. What if I told you that earning $125,000 a year doesn't meaningfully protect you from this? The narrative around financial fragility usually sounds like this. People are bad with money. They overspend, they undersave, they make impulsive decisions. If they just had more discipline, they'd be fine. And some of that is true. Behavior matters. But look at what the data shows when you control for income. Households earning $100,000 to $100,000 a year, solidly upper middle class by any conventional measure, are nearly as financially exposed as households earning half that once you account for fixed costs. Same credit card balances relative to income. Similar savings buffers, nearly identical shock absorber depth. The income went up. The margin didn't. Here's what higher income looks like from the outside: stability, options, breathing room. Here's what it looks like in the transaction data: a more expensive version of the exact same fragility, a bigger mortgage, a leased car instead of a financed one, private school tuition instead of daycare. The obligations scaled with the income so precisely that the gap, the actual breathing room, barely moved. This is why the problem can't be solved by earning more, and why advice that starts with "just make more money" misses the point entirely. The households that look most stable on paper often carry the most invisible fragility, because their fixed cost structure is built on the assumption that nothing will go wrong, and that assumption is always, eventually, wrong. The trap isn't irresponsibility. The trap is that the normal path, the one your parents took, your neighbors took, the one every advertisement points you toward, is built on leverage that scales with your income whether you intend it to or not. Say that again: leverage that scales with your income whether you intend it to or not. What separates households who recover from a shock and households who collapse from one isn't discipline, it's margin. And that margin has been getting systematically compressed at every income level. By rising fixed costs, by easy credit, and by a culture that treats consuming as a sign of success and saving as a form of sacrifice. The households closest to the edge didn't fail the system. The system required them to walk this close to it, and then quietly required the same of the people one tax bracket up. So what do you actually do about it? Because I promised you something concrete, not generic. And the answer starts with measuring a number most financial advice never mentions. So back to where we started. 56% of Americans can't cover a $1,000 emergency. You now know why that number is what it is. The question you actually came here for is what someone does about it, concretely, not generically. Here's the answer, and it starts with measuring the right thing. Here's what most people track: income, savings balance, maybe net worth. Here's what actually predicts your resilience: margin, the gap between your fixed monthly obligations and your take-home pay. Calculate that number this week. If your fixed costs consume more than 80% of your take-home pay, You are operating without a functional shock absorber. That's not a judgment, that's a diagnostic, and you cannot fix what you haven't measured. Second, the most powerful single move available to most households isn't cutting variable spending. It's identifying one sticky fixed cost and building a specific 12-month exit from it. A car payment you could refinance or eliminate. A lease renewal you could negotiate down. A subscription bundle that quietly doubled in price. One fixed cost removed permanently does more for your resilience than years of skipping discretionary spending, because it changes your baseline. It structurally widens your margin rather than requiring ongoing willpower to maintain it. Here's the third one, and this is where most financial advice stops short, including the advice that was probably good enough to get you this far. Build what you could call a shock script. Know in advance, right now, exactly what you would do if a 1,000 emergency hit tomorrow. Which account does it come from? What gets paused? Who do you call? Households that have thought through that scenario in advance recover from financial shocks faster than households who are figuring it out in the middle of one. The bad month is coming. The question is whether you meet it with a plan or with panic. And there's one more layer to this, the reason the shock script works even when the numbers aren't perfect yet. But that's its own video, and I'll link it at the end. Margin is the metric. Not income, not net worth, not the savings number you feel vaguely good about. Margin, and the plan you have to protect it. 56% of Americans can't cover a $1,000 emergency. Now you know the real reason, not bad choices, but a structural compression of margin that happens across income levels to perfectly normal decisions in a system that was never designed to leave people with much breathing room. Remember that surprising group I mentioned at the start? That's who we just spent the last few minutes on. Households earning $100,000 to $150,000 a year, nearly as exposed as households earning half as much. That's the inversion. And now you can see why income alone never tells you the full story. Understanding that doesn't let anyone off the hook. It changes where you direct your energy. You stop directing it at shame, at the idea that you should have been smarter or more disciplined, and you start directing it at the one variable that actually determines your resilience, the gap between what you owe every month and what comes in. From shame to strategy, that's the shift. And the people who make that shift are the ones who stop being surprised by bad months and start being prepared for them. If this way of thinking about money is useful to you, subscribe. There's more of this kind of analysis on the channel. And drop a comment with the money topic you want unpacked next. I read everyone, and they genuinely shape what gets made here.